The wind bit through Alara's threadbare shawl, a cruel laugh against the silence that stretched between her and the empty platform. The train, a black beast of smoke and iron, had long since pulled away, leaving behind only the chill of the dying afternoon and the crushing weight of utter desertion. Her father, a man whose hands had always felt more like callous strangers than a father's embrace, had sold her to this station, to a promise that had withered before the ink was dry on the contract. He'd simply stated, his voice flat as the prairie horizon, that a man was waiting. No man waited, only the biting wind and the bitter truth. She clutched her swollen belly, a silent prayer to a God she wasn't sure listened anymore. The shame, a cold knot in her gut, churned alongside the nausea. 2 days' journey from everything she knew, only to be cast out. A broken promise on a desolate stretch of land. Her trunk, a pitiful square of worn leather, sat beside her, a monument to a life that had never truly begun. Desperation, a sharp claw, raked at her throat. She wasn't sure if the tremors shaking her were from the cold, the hunger, or the sheer, paralyzing fear of what came next. There was no one, no kin, no friend, no familiar face in this alien territory. Only the vast, indifferent sky. A shadow fell over her, long and unhurried. Alara flinched, pulling the shawl tighter, her eyes darting up. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette stark against the fading light. He wasn't young, his face was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of sun and sorrow, and his dark eyes, though shadowed by the brim of his hat, held a weary kindness that was startling in its unexpectedness. He didn't speak, didn't move closer, just observed. He looked like a man who knew loss, like a man who understood silence. Her breath hitched. Was this the groom, finally? The man who had been delayed? A flicker of a foolish hope, quickly extinguished by the cold logic of her abandonment. No. A man who truly wanted a bride wouldn't leave her shivering on a platform like an unwanted stray. This man, whoever he was, carried a different air, an air of quiet strength, of burdens patiently borne. He wasn't a predator, but an observer. The very air around him felt heavy with unspoken stories, a weight that mirrored her own. She didn't look back at the empty tracks. She couldn't. The past was a place she was no longer allowed to visit. This station was a gateway, she dimly understood, not to a new beginning as a wife, but to an unknown, frightening wilderness. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The widower, for that was what Josiah Miller was, stood a respectful distance from the young woman huddled on the bench. Her exhaustion was a palpable thing, a cloak she wore over the obvious curve of her belly. He'd come to meet the train, a weekly ritual in the small town of Harmony, mainly to pick up supplies and the infrequent parcel. He hadn't expected to find a girl barely out of her teens, alone and clearly distressed. The station master, a gruff but decent man named Silas, had shaken his head. Left her here, Josiah. Groom never showed. Came a wire from Chicago. Engagement called off. Poor thing. Don't even know her name. Josiah's gaze softened. He'd seen that look before, in his own eyes, after the fever took Eleanor and their youngest. A look of complete and utter lostness. He knew what it meant to feel the world had forgotten you, leaving you adrift. He cleared his throat, the sound a rough rumble in the stillness. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low, gentle. "You all right? You look like you could use a warm meal." She flinched, pulling her shawl tighter, as if his words were blows. Her eyes, wide and bruised with unshed tears, met his. He saw fear there, deep and raw. He understood. A young woman alone, pregnant, abandoned, and a stranger offering help. It was a world where kindness often masked darker intentions. I'm fine," she whispered, her voice reedy, barely audible above the rising wind. A tremor ran through her, betraying the lie. He knew she wasn't fine. He also knew she was wary, rightfully so. "Silas tells me you're expecting a child." It wasn't a question, but an observation, stated with a quiet understanding that didn't feel like judgment. He remembered Eleanor, heavy with their second child, the easy way she'd laughed. This girl, she carried a heavy burden, not just the babe within her, but the world's harsh verdict outside. "My name's Josiah Miller. I live a few miles out of town. I got a small place, not much, but it's warm. And I've got a boy, young Thomas, who could use a woman's touch. Not that I mean to. Well, you understand. He fumbled for words, unused to such delicate conversations. He wasn't offering marriage, not exactly, but a safe harbor. A temporary reprieve from the cruel indifference of the world. Ilara stared, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and suspicion. A man, a widower, offering her sanctuary? It sounded too good, too simple, too dangerous. Every instinct screamed caution. Her father's betrayal had taught her that trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered. Yet, the cold was seeping into her bones, and the ache in her empty stomach was growing unbearable. She looked at his face again, searching for the glint of deceit, the flicker of a hidden agenda. She saw only weariness, and a deep, quiet sincerity. He wasn't looking at her like a piece of property, or a ruined woman, but simply as another human being in dire need. He spoke of his boy, of warmth, of a place to rest. The choice, stark and terrifying, hung in the air. Stay on the desolate platform and face the certain harshness of the night, or step into the unknown with this strange, kind man. She didn't have much left to lose. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and profound uncertainty. Josiah didn't press. He understood that a choice made under duress wasn't a true choice. He simply stood, a steady presence, offering the silent promise of a different path. Ilara's gaze swept over the vast, darkening landscape, the endless prairie stretching to the horizon, offering no refuge. The town, a cluster of dim lights in the distance, felt as cold and unwelcoming as the empty tracks. She thought of her unborn child, a fragile life depending on her, already bearing the scars of circumstance. What kind of future could she offer them? Out here, alone and abandoned. You bought me for $60, she said, the words a raw whisper, barely more than a breath. The contract her father had shown her, though now clearly worthless, had outlined the sum. It was her only reference point for her own worth in this transaction. Josiah's brow furrowed, a flicker of pain in his eyes. Ma'am, I haven't paid a cent for you, and I wouldn't. A person ain't something to be bought. He paused, weighing his words carefully. I'm offering you a place. A temporary place, where you and your babe can be safe. No strings, no demands. Just a roof, and food, and a chance to figure things out. He let the words hang, stripped of embellishment, plain-spoken and true. He knew the world saw a pregnant woman alone as damaged goods, but he also knew the difference between a broken vessel and one that had simply been mishandled. She wasn't broken. Ilara's shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in a profound exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. The truth of his words, stripped of any pretense, landed with a soft thud. He wasn't buying her. He was offering her a choice, a terrifying, improbable act of kindness. The shame she'd carried, the burden of her unwanted state, eased a fraction, replaced by a tentative, fragile hope. She didn't know what to do with such unexpected grace. Her life had been a series of hard bargains, of taking what little was offered. This felt different, unearned. I don't have anything to give you in return, she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. Her eyes searched his, a desperate plea for honesty. Could she trust this man? This complete stranger? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her father's face, cold and indifferent as he'd spoken of the sum, flashed in her mind. He had sold her. This man, he was offering safety, not purchase. Josiah gave a slow nod. You don't owe me a thing, ma'am. Just a promise to look after yourself and your babe. That's payment enough for me. He extended a large, calloused hand, not quite reaching for her, but offering a silent invitation. The gesture was open, unthreatening. It was a choice to accept a tentative connection. Ilara hesitated. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and surprisingly gentle. The first flicker of healing, perhaps, for them both. The journey to Josiah's farm was quiet. The only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the distant hoot of an owl. Alara sat beside him on the hard wooden seat, her hands still tingling from the unexpected warmth of his touch. He didn't press her with questions, for which she was profoundly grateful. His silence felt like a kindness, a space for her to simply exist without explanation or judgment. She found herself glancing at him, a fleeting assessment. His profile, strong and unyielding against the twilight, seemed to speak of a life lived close to the earth, grounded in something real. A small, rough-hewn house eventually appeared out of the gathering darkness, a faint glow of lamplight spilling from its windows. It wasn't grand, but it looked solid, enduring. "My home," Josiah said, his voice quiet, almost reflective. "It's small, just me and Thomas." He gestured vaguely to the house, then to a smaller shape moving in the lamplight. A boy. Her heart clenched. A child. She thought of her own, a constant flutter beneath her ribs. What would it be like to be a mother? To have a child to care for, to love, without the constant weight of fear and uncertainty? She had never known the warmth of a true family, only the cold precision of her father's household, where duty outweighed affection. A fleeting image came to her, a memory from her childhood. A worn rag doll, her only confidant, clutched tight in the dark, the faint smell of dust and neglect clinging to its fabric. She had been left alone often, her presence a burden, an inconvenience. As the wagon drew closer, the boy, Thomas, stepped out, a small lantern clutched in his hand. He was perhaps 8 or 9, his face a smaller, softer version of Josiah's, with wide, curious eyes. He looked up at Alara, a shy, tentative smile on his lips. "Pa, you're back," he called, his voice thin but clear. Then his gaze fell on Alara, and his smile faltered, replaced by a look of bewildered inquiry. "Thomas, this is our guest," Josiah said, a slight hesitation in his voice. He hadn't thought what to call her. He knew only her desperation, not her history. Alara felt a fresh wave of shame wash over her. A guest, not a wife, not a friend, just a temporary inhabitant, an object of charity. She was a woman carrying another man's child, an unspeakable scandal in most decent towns. What would this boy think of her? What would the town say? "Hello, Thomas," Alara managed, her voice cracking slightly. She forced a small smile, trying to appear less like the disaster she felt she was. She wanted to be worthy of this tentative connection, this unexpected offer of safety. The boy, however, simply stared, his small face unreadable. He was a mirror, she realized, reflecting her own vulnerability, her fear of judgment. She had endured so much, but the eyes of an innocent child held a particular power, capable of stripping away all pretense. The thought of burdening this kind man and his son, of bringing her shame into their quiet world, was a heavy weight. The small, one-room cabin was clean and warm, smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs. A cot had been hastily set up in a corner, covered with a thick woolen blanket. "It ain't much, but it's dry," Josiah said, gesturing to the cot. He placed her worn trunk beside it. "Thomas is sleeping on the floor for a spell. He didn't mind." Alara felt a pang of guilt. A child, giving up his bed for her. This wasn't just a simple act of charity. It was a sacrifice. She sat on the edge of the cot, the unfamiliar warmth seeping into her chilled limbs. The journey had drained her, leaving her hollowed out, but the raw edge of desperation had dulled. Josiah stoked the fire, its flames dancing, casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his presence solid and comforting. He put a plate of stew in front of her, steaming and fragrant. It was the best thing she had ever tasted, each spoonful a battle against the hunger that had gnawed at her for days. "You don't have to speak about anything you don't want to," Josiah said, sensing her discomfort. He sat opposite her, a cup of coffee steaming in his large hands. "But if you ever feel like it, my ears are open." He didn't pry, didn't demand explanations. He simply offered a quiet space for her to unfurl, if she chose to. He understood that some scars ran too deep for easy revelation. Alara ate slowly, savoring each bite. The warmth in her belly began to thaw the cold in her heart. She found herself watching Thomas, who sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing in the dirt with a stick, seemingly oblivious to her presence. He was a quiet boy, much like his father. She wondered about his mother, the woman who had once filled this space. Her own mother had died when she was young, a hazy memory of a soft touch and a lullaby. The grief had been swift, then replaced by the chill of her father's emotional distance. "My father, he sold me," she finally whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. They felt like a secret, a heavy burden finally released. The shame burned in her cheeks, but she met Josiah's gaze, needing to see his reaction. Josiah didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, sorrowful. "I reckon some men forget what's truly valuable," he said, his voice low and steady. "They mistake flesh and blood for chattel." He didn't condemn her, didn't express disgust. He simply acknowledged the profound injustice. It was a revelation for Alara, to have her pain met with understanding, not judgment. "He said I was ruined," she continued, the words now coming easier, though still laced with pain. "That I was a burden, a disgrace, that no decent man would have me." The accusation had burrowed deep, forming a core of self-loathing that had shadowed her every step. Josiah looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet strength. "Decent men don't sell their daughters, ma'am, and a person ain't ruined by the wrongs done to them. You're not broken. You're simply hurt, and in need of kindness." He didn't dismiss her pain, but redefined it. He saw her not as a casualty, but as someone worthy of healing. It was the first time in her life anyone had offered such a profound affirmation. She realized then that the tentative connection was growing, like a fragile seedling reaching for the sun. Days bled into weeks, each one a slow, gentle unfolding of Alara's fractured world. The farm, once a symbol of the unknown, began to feel like a haven. Josiah never once pressed her for more details of her past, his quiet understanding a comforting blanket. He simply allowed her to exist, to heal at her own pace. She found herself falling into a rhythm, helping with the chores she could manage, mending clothes, preparing simple meals, even tending to the small kitchen garden. The simple tasks, once a source of drudgery, now felt like a pathway to belonging. Thomas, the widower's son, was a silent shadow at first. He'd observe her with wide, unblinking eyes, then dart away when she met his gaze. Alara remembered her own solitary childhood, the deep ache of being unwanted, and her heart went out to the boy. One afternoon, she found him struggling to tie a knot on a fishing line. She knelt beside him, her movements slow and deliberate, and gently took the line. "Like this," she murmured, her fingers deftly demonstrating the knot. He watched, fascinated, then tried to mimic her. A small, tentative connection, built not on words, but on shared, quiet moments. The farm itself seemed to breathe around them. The scent of pine and rich earth, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant lowing of cattle. It was a world away from the dusty, indifferent streets of her youth. She found metaphors in the natural world, the tenacity of a wildflower pushing through cracked earth, the silent strength of old trees weathering the winter storms. These were the quiet wins, she realized. Not heroic triumphs, but the daily endurance, the choosing to stay, to root down in a place of tentative safety. One evening, as dusk settled, casting long purple shadows across the fields, Alara found Josiah sitting on the porch, staring out at the land. "You miss her, don't you?" she asked, her voice soft, referring to his late wife. He nodded, a slow, melancholic gesture. Every day, she was the light in this place, the anchor. His voice was tinged with sorrow, a deep, familiar ache. He wasn't a man to hide his grief, but to carry it with dignity. "My mother died when I was small," Alara confided, the words feeling strangely light, as if speaking them aloud lessened their weight. "I barely remember her face, only a feeling, like warmth, a fleeting warmth." Josiah turned, his eyes meeting hers. "A mother's warmth stays with you, even if the memory fades. It's like a seed planted in the heart." His words resonated, a quiet affirmation. She was carrying that seed now, within her, a new life. And here, in this quiet home, she was beginning to understand what belonging truly meant. Not as a possession, but as a connection forged through shared burdens and unspoken understanding. The shame that had clung to her like a shroud began to unravel, replaced by a sense of quiet purpose. She wasn't alone, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a burden. This found belonging, born from unexpected kindness, was a fragile thing, yet it felt stronger than anything she had ever known. The tentative peace of Josiah's farm was shattered by the arrival of Reverend Albright and Mrs. Henderson, their faces grim, their expressions radiating righteous indignation. They were the self-appointed moral guardians of harmony, and their presence on the secluded farm was a harbinger of trouble. Ilara's stomach clenched. She'd known this day might come. Her presence, a pregnant, unmarried woman living with a widower, was a scandal waiting to erupt. Reverend Albright, a portly man with a perpetually disapproving frown, cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice laced with unctuous authority, "we are here on a matter of community concern." There are whispers. Mrs. Henderson, a wiry woman with a mouth set in a permanent sneer, stepped forward, her eyes raking over Ilara. Whispers about sin, about impropriety, about a poor, innocent boy being corrupted by circumstances. Her gaze was accusatory, sharp as a knife. Ilara felt the familiar prickle of public shaming, the cold dread that had accompanied her father's harsh pronouncements. She was once again the unwanted, the tainted. Her hands instinctively went to her belly, a protective gesture. She was a burden, not just to herself, but now to Josiah and Thomas. The moral tension between her freedom, her right to simply exist, and the need for belonging, for acceptance in this small community, was agonizing. Josiah stepped forward, placing himself subtly between Ilara and the intruders. His posture was calm, but his jaw was set, a quiet defiance in his eyes. "Reverend Mrs. Henderson, my home is my own, and the lady here is a guest in need of sanctuary. Nothing more." "Sanctuary for a woman of ill repute?" Mrs. Henderson scoffed, her voice rising. "A woman carrying a child out of wedlock? It's an affront to God and decent society." Ilara's breath hitched. The words were familiar, the accusations she'd heard her whole life. She was dirtied, ruined. She was desperate, and that desperation was always mistaken for weakness. Thomas, who had been playing quietly in the corner, looked up, his small face etched with confusion and fear. He glanced from the angry faces of the visitors to his father, then to Ilara, as if sensing the unspoken threat. The innocence of children in danger was a powerful emotional trigger, and Ilara felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. She might be shamed, but she would not allow this venom to touch the boy who had unknowingly offered her a glimpse of belonging. "We have a duty, Mr. Miller," the Reverend continued, his voice growing louder, "to ensure the moral fabric of our community remains intact. We cannot have such arrangements, setting a bad example." He was hinting at forcing Ilara to leave, perhaps even demanding Josiah turn her over to the town authorities to be sent away. A wave of helplessness washed over Ilara. This wasn't a storm she could outrun, or a predator she could hide from. This was the crushing weight of societal judgment, a force far more insidious than any physical threat. She felt trapped, like a small animal caught in a snare. The tentative trust she had built with Josiah, the fragile sense of safety, felt suddenly tenuous, threatened by the self-righteous wrath of those who claimed to speak for God. The loyalty of Josiah was being tested, and she feared she would be the cause of his undoing. The air in the small cabin crackled with unspoken tension. Ilara felt the weight of every accusing glance, every thinly veiled insult. Her past, an unwritten narrative of hardship and abandonment, seemed to hang in the air, allowing these self-appointed judges to fill in the blanks with their own cruel assumptions. She thought of the long journey, the days of hunger and fear, the moment her father had cast her aside like a discarded possession. Those scars, invisible yet deep, throbbed with renewed pain. Josiah, however, stood firm. His gaze, usually kind, now held a glint of steel. "Reverend Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, despite the escalating emotional turn, "my home is a place of sanctuary, not of sin." He wasn't arguing the specifics of Ilara's situation. He was defending the very principle of kindness and refuge. This wasn't a triumphant roar, but a quiet, unwavering stand. It was a choice. Mrs. Henderson sneered. "A man of God, Mr. Miller, would not harbor such a fallen woman. What about your reputation? What about Thomas's future?" "My reputation," Josiah stated, his voice devoid of anger, but steeped in an immovable conviction, is built on how I treat my fellow man, not on the whispers of busybodies. As for Thomas, his future will be shaped by the lessons of compassion, not of cruelty. Alara watched him, a strange mix of terror and awe washing over her. He was sacrificing his standing in the community, potentially even his livelihood. For her, he was choosing to protect her, an act of loyalty she had never known. The moral ambiguity of authority figures, as represented by the Reverend and Mrs. Henderson, stood in stark contrast to Josiah's unyielding decency. "You are making a grave mistake, Mr. Miller," the Reverend intoned, his face red with indignation. "This defiance will not go unnoticed. The town has its ways of dealing with those who stray from the path of righteousness." It was a veiled threat, a foreshadowing of community judgment. But Josiah didn't back down. "Then the town will have to deal with a man who believes in a different kind of righteousness, one that feeds the hungry, shelters the lost, and offers kindness where none is given." He didn't raise his voice, but the power in his words was undeniable. It was a quiet win. He wasn't vanquishing them with force, but with unwavering moral conviction. The Reverend and Mrs. Henderson, thwarted by Josiah's calm resolve, exchanged furious glances. They had expected an easy victory, a cowering woman, a shamed man. Instead, they met an unyielding wall of quiet integrity. With a final, disgusted huff, Mrs. Henderson turned and stalked out, the Reverend hurrying after her. The cabin felt suddenly vast and silent in their absence, the air still thick with the residue of their judgment, but also with the quiet triumph of Josiah's stand. Ilara felt a rush of tears, hot and unexpected. Not tears of sorrow, but of profound gratitude and a staggering realization of her own worth in his eyes. He hadn't seen her as ruined, but as hurt. He hadn't seen her as a burden, but as someone worthy of his protection. He had chosen her, chosen compassion over societal approval. The shame that had been her constant companion began to recede further, replaced by a nascent feeling of being truly seen, truly valued. She was not broken, she was simply healing, one act of quiet, unwavering kindness at a time. The aftermath of the Reverend and Mrs. Henderson's visit left a palpable quiet in the cabin, a profound stillness that settled over them like the first snow. Alara, sitting by the fire, watched Josiah mend a broken harness strap, his hands steady and capable. The danger hadn't entirely vanished. She knew the whispers would intensify, that community judgment would simmer, but Josiah's unwavering loyalty had provided a shield. He hadn't just offered her a roof, he had offered her sanctuary for her soul. "Thank you," she whispered, the words small but laden with a gratitude too vast for their size. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, a shared understanding passing between them. "Didn't do anything but what was right," he replied, his voice gruff but gentle. He meant it. For him, compassion was not a choice, but a fundamental principle. The quiet strength of his actions affirmed something deep within Alara. She had spent her life feeling like a leaf blown by an indifferent wind, unwanted and without purpose. Now, she felt rooted, anchored by the unexpected kindness of this man. Her pregnancy was advancing, and with it, a new kind of fear mixed with a fierce, protective love for the life growing inside her. She felt the weight of her responsibilities, but also the deep satisfaction of having someone to protect, a future to build. One afternoon, a harsh winter storm swept across the prairie, trapping them indoors for days. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, shaking the cabin, rattling the windows. It was a formidable external threat, a reminder of the raw power of nature. During those long hours, huddled by the fire, Ilara watched Thomas draw in the dirt with a stick, his small hand mimicking the shapes of the storm. She saw her own solitary childhood reflected in his quiet play, but then she saw Josiah's watchful gaze, the way he'd quietly offer Thomas a warm drink or tell him a story. This boy was not alone. "Tell me about her," Ilara prompted one evening, sensing a breathing moment after a particularly fierce gust of wind. "Thomas's mother." Josiah paused, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Eleanor. She loved this land, loved beauty, even in the plainest things." He spoke of her with a gentle reverence, a bittersweet remembrance. He didn't romanticize their life, but spoke of the quiet joys, the shared burdens, the deep bond they had built. He spoke of how she had been a true partner, someone who made the choosing to stay easy. Ilara listened, a longing stirring within her for such a connection, for a love that endured even through loss. She had always imagined love to be a fragile, dangerous thing, easily broken, but Josiah's love for Eleanor, even in her absence, felt solid, a testament to its enduring power. It was a kind of healing to witness such abiding affection, the bitter resolution of loss for him, but the affirmation of love's strength for her. She saw that while some scars remain, they do not define or break a person. The storm eventually broke, leaving behind a world transformed by a pristine blanket of snow, silent and clean. Alara stepped outside, inhaling the crisp, cold air. The sun, a pale disk in the sky, cast long shadows. The land, though harsh, held a profound beauty. She felt a quiet peace settle over her, a sense of affirmation. She was here, not by force or coercion, but by choice. She was safe, and for the first time, truly, she felt that she belonged. She wasn't a burden. She was part of something real, something rooted. As spring approached, the land began to stir, shedding its winter dormancy. Alara's time drew nearer, and with it, a new layer of profound connection began to form within the small household. Josiah, ever watchful, ensured she had what she needed, his care unobtrusive but constant. He didn't speak of the future beyond the immediate need, but his actions spoke volumes. He was a man who understood the long, quiet rhythms of the earth, and perhaps the long, quiet rhythms of healing. One sunny afternoon, Alara found Thomas struggling to lift a heavy bucket of water from the well. She watched him, seeing a mirroring of her own helplessness and determination in his small frame. "Here," she said, her voice soft. "Let me help." Together they managed to draw the water, the effort a shared, quiet win. Thomas looked up at her, a rare, uninhibited smile lighting his face. "Thank you, Alara." It was the first time he had used her name, not as the guest or our guest, but simply Alara. A small, profound moment of belonging, earned through shared labor and quiet kindness. She recognized that Josiah wasn't just offering shelter, but a chance for her to mend, to gather herself. He hadn't demanded she be independent or pull herself up by her bootstraps. Instead, he provided the space for her to grow through emotional validation and a slowly earned sense of security. He saw her as not broken, and in his steady gaze, she began to see it too. The birth was long and arduous, a primal struggle that stripped away all pretense. Josiah, despite his gruff exterior, was a steady presence, his hand firm on her shoulder, his face etched with worry but also an unwavering resolve. He fetched warm water, tended the fire, and whispered quiet words of encouragement. When the baby finally arrived, a tiny, wailing girl, the world seemed to hold its breath. Alara, exhausted but overwhelmed by a love so fierce it stole her breath, cradled her daughter. Josiah looked at the infant, then at Alara, his eyes filled with a profound emotion she couldn't quite name. "She's beautiful, Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thomas, drawn by the cries, peered hesitantly into the room. He saw the small, swaddled bundle, then looked at Alara, his eyes wide with wonder. "A baby?" he whispered. Alara, tears streaming down her face, nodded. "Your little sister, Thomas." It was a quiet affirmation, a profound declaration of family, not by blood, but by choice and by belonging. Life on the farm settled into a new rhythm, richer and fuller, with the presence of the infant. Alara found a profound sense of peace in her role as a mother, and as a quiet, vital part of Josiah's home. The external threats hadn't disappeared entirely. The town's whispers still circulated, but they seemed distant, muted by the powerful truth of their found family. She watched Josiah with their daughter, his large hands surprisingly gentle, a quiet affection in his eyes. He wasn't a hero in the grand, sweeping sense, but he was a hero in the everyday acts of kindness, in the quiet strength of his loyalty. One evening, as Alara held her sleeping daughter, watching the stars blaze across the vast, dark sky, Josiah sat beside her on the porch. "You're home now, Alara," he said, his voice soft. It wasn't a question, but a quiet statement of fact. She leaned her head against the rough wood of the post, a soft sigh escaping her. The scars of her past remained, etched into her memory, but they no longer defined her. The burden of shame had lifted, replaced by the profound weight of love and belonging. She thought of her father, of the abandonment, of the desperation that had nearly consumed her, and then she thought of Josiah, and Thomas, and the tiny precious life in her arms. They were a family, forged in adversity, bound by kindness and unwavering trust. The quiet win of choosing to stay, of sacrificing fear for family, had brought her to this bittersweet resolution. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real. It was peace, and it was enough.